The night was heavy with the scent of rain that had passed only an hour before. The streets of Maplewood, a quiet suburb just outside Washington, D.C., were slick with water, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. It was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on its manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and a sense of order that often masked the unspoken tensions bubbling beneath its surface. Dr. Malcolm Carter sighed as he turned his car into the parking lot of a small convenience store. The long hours at NASA had drained him, and all he wanted was to grab a few essentials before heading home to his wife and daughter. He adjusted his glasses as he stepped out of his black Tesla. Stretching his tired limbs, the store was nearly empty, just the cashier, a teenage boy with earbuds in, and an elderly woman browsing the snacks aisle. Malcolm grabbed a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of orange juice before heading toward the counter. As he walked, he felt a strange sensation, a tingling at the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. He glanced around but saw no one paying him any mind. It wasn't paranoia. It was a feeling he had learned to trust. The feeling of being observed, scrutinized, judged. He paid for his groceries, offering the teenage cashier a polite nod before heading toward the exit. But the moment he stepped outside, his stomach tightened. A police cruiser was parked at the far end of the lot, engine idling, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Standing next to it was a uniformed officer, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on Malcolm. Something about the officer's stance, rigid, predatory, put Malcolm on edge. He had dealt with men like this before, the kind who saw his skin before they saw his humanity. "Hey, you there," the officer barked. Malcolm kept his steps measured, his breath even, as he continued toward his car. Maybe if he just ignored the officer, he wouldn't have to deal with whatever was about to unfold. "Stop right there." He had no choice now. Malcolm halted, gripping his grocery bag a little tighter before slowly turning around. The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and cold, calculating eyes, was already walking toward him, one hand resting on his holster. "Is there a problem, officer?" Malcolm asked, keeping his tone even. The officer, his badge read Mitchell, tilted his head, scanning Malcolm up and down. "You tell me. We got a call about a suspicious individual loitering near this store." Malcolm's brow furrowed. He had barely spent 5 minutes inside. "I'm just on my way home. Bought some groceries." Mitchell smirked. "Oh, yeah? Let's see some ID." A sinking feeling settled in Malcolm's gut. He had no warrants, no record, no reason to be stopped. He knew he had the right to ask why he was being questioned. But he also knew how these situations often ended for men like him. "Sure," he said, keeping his voice calm as he reached into his pocket. He moved slowly, deliberately, aware of how any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. He handed over his driver's license, watching as Mitchell scrutinized it longer than necessary. "Dr. Malcolm Carter," the officer read aloud, his tone almost mocking. "Doctor? Huh? What kind of doctor are you?" "I'm a physicist," Malcolm replied. "I work at NASA." Something flickered in Mitchell's expression, doubt, maybe even disbelief, but it quickly vanished, replaced by something colder. "That's so?" he muttered, handing the ID back with an almost dismissive flick of his fingers. "You live around here?" "Yes," Malcolm replied, "a few blocks away." Mitchell nodded slowly, as if weighing his next words. Then he stepped closer. "You look nervous." Malcolm stiffened. "I'm not." Mitchell smirked. "You sure about that?" This was a game, one Malcolm refused to play. "I'd like to be on my way now." "Officer," he said, making a move toward his car. But before he could take another step, Mitchell grabbed his arm, hard, and just like that, everything changed. Pain shot up Malcolm's arm as Mitchell's grip tightened. The officer yanked him backward, causing him to stumble. The grocery bag fell from his hand, the carton of milk bursting open on the pavement, white liquid pooling at their feet. "Hey," Malcolm protested, struggling to free himself. Mitchell shoved him against the side of his Tesla. "Got something to hide, Doc?" The title, once spoken with respect in his workplace, was now spat out like an insult. "I have nothing to hide," Malcolm said, his voice rising with frustration. "I've done nothing wrong." A second officer appeared, as if summoned from the darkness. This one was younger, blonde-haired, with a nervous energy about him. "Everything okay, Ryan?" Mitchell, Ryan, apparently, grinned. Just checking out a possible suspect. The younger cop hesitated. He doesn't look. Ryan shot him a look that silenced whatever doubt he had. Then he turned back to Malcolm. Put your hands behind your back. Malcolm's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Why? Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he forced Malcolm's arm back, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A sharp pain flared up Malcolm's shoulder, and a startled cry escaped his lips. Stop resisting, Ryan growled. I'm not resisting. But it didn't matter. In a matter of seconds, cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists, biting into his skin. A crowd had started to gather, people emerging from the store. Cars slowing down as drivers watched the scene unfold. Someone had their phone out, recording. Mitchell leaned in, his breath hot against Malcolm's ear. You think just because you wear a suit and work for NASA, you're different? You're just another thug in a nice car. Rage surged through Malcolm, but he swallowed it down. He had seen how these stories ended. He refused to be another name on the news. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell flickered with a dull hum, casting a sickly yellow glow over the small, grimy room. The concrete bench beneath Malcolm was cold and unforgiving, his wrists sore from the tightness of the handcuffs that had only recently been removed. No phone call, no explanation, just hours of waiting. From the moment he had been thrown into the back of the squad car, Malcolm had remained silent. Arguing wouldn't help. Fighting wouldn't help. All he could do was wait. Occasionally, an officer would walk past the holding area, some sneering, others indifferent. None acknowledged his requests to speak to a lawyer. Then, finally, the door creaked open. A woman in a suit stepped in, her expression a mix of anger and professionalism. Dr. Carter, she said, her voice clipped. I'm your attorney, and we have a serious problem. Ryan Mitchell leaned back in his chair at the precinct, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee as he scrolled through his phone. Then he saw it. A viral video. His own face, caught in perfect clarity, shoving Malcolm against his car, twisting his arm, spitting words he didn't even fully remember saying. The caption read, NASA scientist beaten and arrested by racist cop. Ryan's stomach turned to ice. Then his phone buzzed. It was the precinct chief. And he knew, without even answering, that his life was about to change. The morning air in Washington, D.C. carried a crisp sharpness, the kind that hinted at an early autumn creeping in. The city was already awake, bustling with activity, but inside the headquarters of NASA, an entirely different storm was brewing. The conference room on the 23rd floor was packed with high-ranking officials, senior scientists, and PR representatives, all huddled around a long mahogany table. At the head of the room, Dr. Elizabeth Warner, the director of NASA, stood with her arms crossed, her gaze locked on the large screen mounted on the wall. The video played again, the one that had been spreading across social media at an uncontrollable speed. There, for the 100th time, she watched as Dr. Malcolm Carter was shoved against his own car, his groceries spilling onto the pavement, a knee pressed into his back as cold metal cuffs were slapped onto his wrists. The words the officer spat at him burned into her mind. You think just because you wear a suit and work for NASA, you're different? Silence filled the room as the clip ended, leaving behind an undeniable sense of outrage. This, Warner said finally, her voice like steel, is unacceptable. Across the table, Daniel Vaughn, NASA's chief public affairs officer, exhaled sharply. The press is already circling like vultures. News agencies, civil rights organizations, even members of Congress are demanding answers. What about Dr. Carter? Another official asked. Has anyone spoken to him? He's still being held at the precinct, Warner said, shaking her head. Unbelievable. A man of his stature. A senior research scientist. No. Forget that. A citizen should never have been treated this way. One of the board members, a man in a navy suit and wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. NASA must release a statement immediately. If we don't control the narrative, the damage to our reputation. This isn't about reputation, Warner snapped. This is about justice. The room fell silent again. Then Vaughn spoke. We need to escalate this. Contact the mayor. Contact the governor. Hell, if we have to, we'll bring it to the White House. Dr. Carter is one of our own. And we won't stand by while he's treated like a criminal. Warner nodded. Get it done. And make sure we have legal representation ready when we go get him out of there. The fight had begun. Ryan Mitchell sat in the dimly lit briefing room of the precinct. His hands clenched together as he stared down at the desk. The weight in his chest was suffocating. A cold, creeping fear that coiled tighter with each passing second. The video had exploded overnight. His name, his face, it was everywhere. Across from him, Captain Douglas Hargrove, a thick-set man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a perpetually stern expression, exhaled through his nose and tossed a tablet onto the table. The screen showed Ryan's face frozen mid-motion, his grip tight around Malcolm Carter's arm. "This looks real bad, Mitchell." Ryan swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Sir." He was acting suspicious. "I followed protocol." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "Protocol? Protocol? Jesus Christ. Do you even understand what's happening here? That man," he jabbed a finger at the screen, "is a goddamn NASA scientist. He's got Washington in an uproar. And now we've got the DOJ breathing down our necks. You put us in this situation." Ryan's pulse pounded. "With all due respect, Captain, how was I supposed to know who he was?" "That's the problem, Mitchell," Hargrove snapped. "You didn't bother to know. You saw a black man in a nice car. And you assumed." Ryan's skin prickled with heat. "I didn't assume anything. I was responding to a call about suspicious activity." "Oh, give me a break," Hargrove said, slamming a fist onto the table. He was leaving a goddamn convenience store. Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Hargrove took a deep breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've got the mayor's office on the line. Civil rights groups are already demanding action. They want you suspended, pending investigation." Ryan's body went rigid. "Suspended? You're lucky that's all for now," Hargrove said. "If NASA pushes hard enough, if Carter decides to press charges, you might be looking at a federal lawsuit." Ryan's stomach twisted. "This is bullshit," he muttered. Hargrove leaned in, his voice low. "No, Mitchell. This is the world catching up to you. Now get the hell out of my office." Outside the precinct, a storm was brewing. The sidewalks were packed with protesters, their voices rising in waves of anger. Justice for Malcolm Carter. End police brutality. Black Lives Matter. The scene was unlike anything Maplewood had ever seen before. The press had arrived in full force, their cameras flashing, microphones extended toward anyone willing to speak. In the middle of the crowd, Alicia Carter, Malcolm's wife, stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her dark eyes burned with fury, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She had spent the last 12 hours making phone calls, rallying support, demanding action. Beside her, Malcolm's best friend and fellow scientist, Dr. Julian West, held a sign that read, "Physicists have rights too." When the front doors of the precinct finally swung open, a hush fell over the crowd. Two attorneys emerged first, their expressions grave, and then, at last, Malcolm Carter stepped out into the daylight. Alicia ran forward, throwing her arms around him. Malcolm held her tightly, pressing his forehead against hers as he whispered, "I'm okay." She pulled back, searching his face. "No, you're not." The cameras clicked, the reporters shouted, and then, standing on the courthouse steps, Malcolm turned to face them all. "My name is Dr. Malcolm Carter," he said, his voice firm, clear, steady. "I am not a criminal. I was attacked, I was humiliated, and I was arrested for no reason other than the color of my skin." A roar of approval swept through the crowd. Malcolm took a deep breath. "This is not just about me. This is about every black man who has ever been stopped for simply existing. This is about a system that has allowed officers like Ryan Mitchell to abuse their power without consequence. I refuse to be silent." The crowd erupted into applause. And Malcolm knew, this was only the beginning. Ryan Mitchell sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzing nonstop. He ignored it. He ignored the texts, the voicemails, the furious messages from his family, his so-called friends, his colleagues. The news anchor's voice on the TV droned on. "The officer involved, Ryan Mitchell, has been placed on administrative leave as an internal investigation begins. Sources say that Mitchell has a history of complaints related to racial profiling, though none have led to disciplinary action until now." Ryan squeezed his eyes shut. He had told himself for years that he wasn't racist, that he was just doing his job. But for the first time, an ugly, undeniable thought crept into his mind. What if they were right? He reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the number for his lawyer. But then he scrolled down, stopping on Malcolm Carter's name. For a long time, he just stared. And then, against every instinct, he tapped the call button. It was time to face the truth. The newsroom at WNN, World News Network, was buzzing with energy. The biggest story in the country was unfolding live. And every journalist in the building knew it. Producers hurried back and forth, adjusting cameras, fixing last-minute script edits, and ensuring that the broadcast would be flawless. In the center of the chaos, Rachel Morgan, one of the most respected journalists in America, adjusted her earpiece and took a deep breath. She had interviewed world leaders, tech giants, and controversial figures, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was interviewing Dr. Malcolm Carter, the man at the center of a national firestorm. The studio lights dimmed as the countdown began. The live broadcast was about to start. As the cameras rolled, Rachel turned to Malcolm, who sat across from her, poised and calm, though there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Dr. Carter, thank you for being here tonight," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for having me," Malcolm replied, his tone composed but firm. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "The entire country has seen the footage of your arrest. Millions of people are outraged. Some are calling this a blatant act of racial profiling and police brutality. How do you feel about what happened to you?" Malcolm took a deep breath. "I feel exhausted. I feel angry. But mostly, I feel determined, because what happened to me is not unique. This happens every day to black men and women across America. The only difference is, I have a platform. I have a voice that people are listening to. And I refuse to waste this moment." Rachel nodded. "Your story has sparked a national conversation about race and policing in America. But there are also people, particularly those in law enforcement, who argue that Officer Ryan Mitchell was just doing his job. That he was responding to a call. What do you say to those people?" Malcolm's jaw tightened for a moment before he spoke. "If doing your job means assuming a black man in a nice car must be a criminal, if doing your job means using unnecessary force against an unarmed citizen who posed no threat, then we have a very big problem. The system is broken, and it needs to be fixed." Rachel glanced at her notes. "NASA has issued a statement condemning your treatment. Government officials have called for a full investigation. Do you believe this case will lead to real change?" Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I want to believe that. But I've seen this cycle before. Outrage, protests, a few symbolic changes. And then, in a few months, it's back to business as usual. I won't let that happen this time. We need real accountability. We need policies that prevent this from happening to the next person." Rachel studied him carefully. "Dr. Carter, if Officer Mitchell were watching this right now, what would you say to him?" Malcolm's expression didn't change. His voice was measured, but there was steel beneath it. "I would say that he should think long and hard about what he did. And then, I would tell him that an apology means nothing without action." The screen faded to black. Across the country, people watched. And Officer Ryan Mitchell was one of them. Ryan Mitchell stood outside the precinct, staring at the building he had walked into every day for the past 10 years. But today, everything was different. His suspension was official. The internal investigation had begun. And now, he was being summoned for a formal hearing with Chief Hargrove and the Internal Affairs Division. His heart pounded as he walked through the doors, past officers who either avoided his gaze or watched him with barely concealed disdain. The department was under scrutiny, and he was the one who had put them there. The conference room was filled with high-ranking officials. Chief Hargrove sat at the center, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Next to him was Captain Linda Evans, head of Internal Affairs, her sharp eyes trained on Ryan like a hawk. Ryan took a seat. The air was thick with tension. "Mitchell," Hargrove said, his voice low but firm, "do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" Ryan swallowed hard. "Sir, shut up," Hargrove snapped. "You don't get to talk first. You sit there, and you listen." Ryan clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Evans leaned forward. "We've reviewed your record. You have a history of complaints, racial profiling, excessive force, but they were always brushed aside because there was never enough evidence. This time, there is." Ryan felt his stomach twist. Evans cut him off. "You had a choice that night. Officer Mitchell, you could have assessed the situation properly. You could have recognized that Dr. Carter posed no threat. Instead, you humiliated him, assaulted him, and arrested him on false pretenses. And now the whole country knows it. Ryan gritted his teeth. I made a mistake. Hargrove shook his head. No, Mitchell. A mistake is forgetting to file paperwork. A mistake is misreading a report. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. And this time, you got caught. The room fell into silence. Then Evan said the words that sent a chill down Ryan's spine. We're recommending termination. His world crumbled. Malcolm sat alone in his study, staring at the city skyline through the large window. His home, usually a place of warmth and comfort, felt different tonight. The weight of everything pressed down on him. His phone buzzed. It was Julian. You okay, man? His friend asked. Malcolm exhaled. I don't know. You should be celebrating. You're out. The world is on your side. Ryan Mitchell is probably going to lose his badge. Isn't this what we wanted? Malcolm rubbed his temples. It doesn't feel like enough. Julian was silent for a moment. What would feel like enough? Malcolm didn't have an answer. Because deep down, he knew that punishing one man wouldn't fix the system. This was bigger than Ryan Mitchell. This was about centuries of injustice. And he wasn't done fighting yet. Ryan sat in his apartment, the darkness closing in around him. The hearing was over. The precinct had made its decision. He was finished. His phone rang, the caller ID flashing a familiar name, Ethan Mitchell. His younger brother. Ryan hesitated, then answered. Ryan, what the hell is happening? Ethan's voice was tense. Your face is all over the news. Mom is losing it. Dad won't even talk about it. What did you do? Ryan squeezed his eyes shut. I fucked up. Ethan. Silence. Then Ethan spoke again, softer this time. Do you even realize how much? Do you even see it? Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat. I see it now. Then do something about it. Ethan said, because right now, you're the villain in this story. And if you don't want to be, you better figure out how to change that. The call ended. Ryan stared at his phone, heart pounding. He had a choice to make. And this time, he couldn't afford to make the wrong one. Ryan sat in his car outside the towering office building of NASA, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had spent the last 2 hours sitting there, staring at the entrance, debating whether he should get out. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, yet none of them felt right. A week had passed since his suspension was made public. His name had been dragged through every media outlet in the country. Protesters had stood outside the precinct demanding justice, and his family had practically disowned him. But nothing compared to the weight that sat in his chest now. He took a deep breath and finally stepped out of his car. Every footstep felt heavier as he approached the front desk. I have an appointment, he said, his voice measured. Ryan Mitchell, the receptionist, a woman with warm brown skin and sharp eyes, looked him up and down before checking her screen. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. Dr. Carter is expecting you, she said coolly. Ryan nodded stiffly, following her directions to the private meeting room on the 24th floor. His nerves tightened as he reached the door. With a final breath, he knocked. Come in, a voice called. Ryan stepped inside. Malcolm was seated at the long conference table, dressed in a crisp navy suit. His posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. The atmosphere in the room was tense, filled with unspoken words. Ryan hesitated before pulling out a chair across from him. Thanks for agreeing to meet. Malcolm folded his hands together. I debated whether I should. Ryan met his gaze, but it was difficult. The last time they had seen each other, Malcolm had been on the ground, in cuffs, his face pressed against the pavement. I need to say something, Ryan said, voice quieter now. I was wrong. Malcolm's expression didn't change. Which part? Ryan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. All of it. I was wrong to stop you. Wrong to assume things about you. Wrong to treat you like a suspect when you were just trying to go home. Malcolm nodded slowly. And what do you want from me? Officer Mitchell? Ryan flinched at the title. I don't know, he admitted. I don't expect forgiveness. Hell, I don't even deserve it. But he hesitated, his throat tight. I need to do something. I need to fix this. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward. Fixing this means more than just apologizing to me. Fixing this means looking at the system you were a part of and deciding to tear it down. Can you do that? Ryan swallowed hard. I don't know, he admitted, but I want to try. Ryan spent the next week confronting the ghosts of his past. It started with the complaint records. He had never paid much attention to them before, after all. They had never led to any real consequences. But now, with the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him, he forced himself to go through each one. The names of black and brown men who had filed reports against him stared back at him. Complaints of excessive force, of wrongful stops, of intimidation. The words blurred together, but one line stood out the most. He treated me like I didn't belong, like I was already guilty. Ryan felt sick. He reached for his phone, dialing the number of his former precinct partner, Officer James Reynolds. "Mitchell." James answered, his voice wary. "What do you want?" "I need to ask you something," Ryan said. "When we were on the job together, did you ever think I was racist?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Then James sighed. "You really want to hear the answer to that?" Ryan's stomach twisted. "Yeah, you were an asshole," James said bluntly. "And yeah, man, you had a problem. We all saw it. The way you looked at them. The way you assumed shit before even asking questions. But no one said anything because, well, that's just how things worked." Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." "Then don't be," James said, "but you're gonna have to do more than just talk about it." Ryan nodded, even though James couldn't see him. "I know." Malcolm sat at his desk late into the night. A stack of legal documents spread out before him. His mind was consumed not just with his own case, but with what came next. His arrest had sparked outrage. But outrage wasn't enough. He wanted change. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. "Julian," he greeted as he picked up. "Tell me you're getting some sleep." Julian replied. Malcolm chuckled dryly. "Not much." Julian sighed. "All right, what's the plan?" Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "I've been working on a proposal. A policy change for how officers interact with civilians. Mandatory de-escalation training, an independent review board for racial profiling complaints, and body cam enforcement policies that actually hold officers accountable." Julian whistled. "That's ambitious." "It has to be," Malcolm said. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Julian was quiet for a moment. "And what about Mitchell? Is he really trying to change? Or is this just about saving face?" Malcolm exhaled. "I don't know yet. But I do know one thing, if he's serious, I'm going to make sure he puts in the work." Ryan stood outside the Maplewood Community Center, his stomach twisting in knots. It had been Malcolm's idea. If Ryan truly wanted to understand the consequences of his actions, he needed to hear it from the people affected. Inside, dozens of people had gathered for a community forum. Families, activists, local leaders, many of whom had been protesting for weeks. Ryan hesitated at the door. "Are you just gonna stand there?" He turned to see Malcolm approaching, his expression unreadable. Ryan let out a slow breath. "I don't know if I should be here." "That's not for you to decide," Malcolm said. "You don't get to walk away when it's uncomfortable." Ryan nodded. Then, before he could change his mind, he stepped inside. The room fell silent the moment he walked in. He felt every eye on him. A woman in the front row, an older black woman with weary eyes, stood up. "I remember you," she said. Ryan's mouth went dry. "You pulled my grandson over last year," she continued, her voice heavy with emotion. "Made him sit on the curb for 45 minutes. He was 17. Ryan swallowed. I don't remember." She nodded. "Of course you don't, but he does." Ryan's chest tightened. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said finally. "I'm here to listen." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she sat back down. Malcolm nodded toward the empty chair in the center of the room. "Then sit down," he said. Ryan took a deep breath. And he did. Ryan sat in the middle of the community center, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him. The weight of their gazes felt like a physical force pressing down on his chest. He had spent years in a uniform, walking through these very neighborhoods. Yet he had never truly seen them. Not like this. A young man, no older than 20, stood up from the back of the room. His arms were crossed, his expression filled with barely contained anger. "My name's Jamal Porter," he said. "You pulled me over last year. You threw me against the hood of my car because you thought I stole it." Ryan clenched his fists beneath the table. He couldn't remember Jamal's face, but he remembered the action. Jamal's voice shook with fury. You didn't ask questions. You didn't care that it was my car. That I worked 2 jobs just to afford it. You saw my skin. And you saw a criminal." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ryan forced himself to meet Jamal's gaze. "I'm sorry." Jamal scoffed. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that every time I see a cop car behind me, I can't breathe." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know. Do you?" Another voice called out. A woman this time. "Because you all say the same thing when you get caught." "I didn't mean it. I was just doing my job." Ryan exhaled. "I did mean it," he admitted, his voice raw. "That's the truth. I wasn't some good guy caught in a bad moment. I saw you the way I was taught to see you. And I let that control me." The room was silent again. But this time, it wasn't just anger, it was shock. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Ryan said, "but I want to be part of the change. Not to clear my name. Not to get my job back. But because I can't keep living with the person I used to be." Jamal studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he sat back down. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a start. Malcolm had spent the last few weeks consumed by a singular mission, turning his trauma into action. Every morning, he was in meetings with legal teams, civil rights groups, and government officials, drafting policy proposals that would hold law enforcement accountable. He knew the system wouldn't change overnight. He knew politicians would resist. But he also knew that if he let this moment slip away, nothing would ever change. His latest meeting was with Senator Deborah Langston, a longtime advocate for police reform. She listened intently as Malcolm laid out his plan. "We need a federal oversight committee for excessive force cases," Malcolm said, "independent of local police departments. No more cops investigating themselves." Langston nodded. "That's a fight worth having." "There's more," Malcolm continued. "Mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. And body cam policies with real consequences when footage mysteriously disappears." Langston sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're asking for a revolution, Dr. Carter." Malcolm met her gaze. "That's exactly what I'm asking for." She studied him for a moment, then finally smiled. "Then let's start a revolution." Ryan had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The Senate Judiciary Committee had called him to testify. And for the first time in his life, he was stepping into a room where the badge wouldn't protect him. The hearing was televised. The entire country was watching. He adjusted his tie, his hands slick with sweat as he sat before the microphone. Across from him, Senator Langston leaned forward. "Officer Mitchell," she began, "you've admitted to racial profiling. You've admitted to using excessive force. What change?" Ryan swallowed. "I saw the consequences of what I did. Not just for Dr. Carter, but for every person I've ever stopped. Every person I humiliated just because I could." Langston arched an eyebrow. "You say you want to help fix the system. How?" Ryan took a breath. "By exposing what happens behind closed doors. The culture inside police departments encourages this behavior. It teaches officers to see black men as threats before they see them as people. I want to help dismantle that." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Langston spoke. "We'll hold you to that, Officer Mitchell." The hearing continued, and Ryan answered every question, some brutal, some humiliating. He admitted to his mistakes, to the failures of the system, to the fact that he had been part of the problem for years. And in doing so, he took the first real step toward becoming part of the solution. Months had passed since that fateful night in the convenience store parking lot. The world had changed in ways Malcolm never could have imagined. His testimony, his fight for policy reform, had led to real changes, new laws, new accountability measures, new training programs for officers nationwide. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Ryan had left the police force for good. Instead, he had dedicated himself to working with civil rights groups, using his inside knowledge to push for reform. He had lost his career. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. One evening, Malcolm found himself back in that same convenience store parking lot, the place where everything had begun. Ryan was there too, waiting for him. Malcolm approached slowly. "Why did you ask me to meet you here?" Ryan glanced around. "I needed to see it again. To remember." Malcolm nodded, understanding. Ryan turned to him. "I know I can't undo what I did to you. I don't expect us to ever be friends. But I want you to know, I'm going to keep fighting. Even when people stop watching. Even when the cameras move on. I won't stop." Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Not in friendship, but in acknowledgement. Ryan hesitated, then took it. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward something better. And sometimes, that was enough.